Salutations, respected viewers. Thanksgiving this year is especially ironic. Well, those Pilgrim Fathers who landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620, they were illegal immigrants. Well, they were, because the Native Americans were already in America. They had their own tribes, or nations we should call them. They had their own systems of government, they had their own laws. Now, did these immigrants from England, did they gain permission before arriving? No, they didn't. They simply arrived. So that would be illegal. Well, I don't actually know what the laws of these Native American peoples were, but they certainly didn't get a green card or something, or whatever its equivalent was, to arrive. And they were going to take land, take jobs, I suppose you would say, because of course in those days almost everybody was a farmer or a hunter. And they didn't learn the Native American languages, by and large. They didn't conform themselves to the culture. So they changed the culture very rapidly, as you can see. You know, within 2 centuries, there were almost no Native Americans living on the east coast of America. And they believed in this very strange Middle Eastern religion. A death cult, as many Native Americans would have felt it, because of course huge numbers of Native Americans were massacred in the next few centuries. Now, I'm not Anglophobic. It's not just the English who've done this. Almost every country has done this to others. And not all English people were to blame even then. And some of the Native Americans came and met these illegal immigrants and took pity on them. They were compassionate. They shared their food with them. And that's what people celebrate on Thanksgiving. So it's richly ironic that some people should be marking Thanksgiving as such a splendid and heart-warming family event, and at the same time railing against illegal immigrants these days, or those who are fleeing from persecution and wish to claim asylum. But there we are. Now, the foregoing was a little flippant on my part, because of course the population of America at the time was much, much lower. There really was some empty land and so on. But you know, after 1607, there were certainly deliberate massacres of Native Americans. Well, there got to be an accidental one. There was certainly genocide. Now, Native Americans weren't wiped out, and it varied considerably. There were some Native American tribes who made agreements with the white immigrants and got on quite well with them. There wasn't some intermarriage, so it wasn't all horrific. But there were times when it was ghastly, and Native American men, women and children were all slaughtered. Likewise, some of the European immigrants were sometimes killed by Native Americans, and the Native American tribes often fought each other. So they're not just pointing the finger at one side, trying to be fair and balanced about it. But anyway, having made my political point, sorry for the rant, let's talk about Thanksgiving in case people are not very well clued up about it. Well, so in England at the time, Christianity was the state religion, as it still is, but the government very much believed it had to impose the right type of Christianity. It was type of Protestantism, to be more particular, the Church of England, and members of the Church of England called Anglicans. The Episcopalian Church in the United States is a copy of the Church of England. Anyone who was outside the Church of England would be discriminated against. They wouldn't be killed, but there were certain jobs they couldn't do. They couldn't get promotion in the state. The Pilgrim Fathers belonged to a more hardline form of Protestantism outside the Church of England. They were Puritans. They believed in being pure, as in no singing, no dancing. It's often summed up as clean living, wearing usually often dark and plain clothes, against smoking tobacco, not for health reasons. They didn't know it was unhealthy. Against sports, merriment, women who had to cover their hair, no jewelry, no makeup, against the theatre, gambling, things like that. They weren't against alcohol. Most people drank small beer because the river water was so foul, probably kill you. So they'd gone to Leiden in the Netherlands, where there was a greater degree of religious liberty, but that didn't pan out for them. So eventually, 1607, they decided to sail to the English plantations in North America. And they took this enormous risk, sailing across the ocean in a small boat. They wanted to get to Virginia, but they had no accurate means of navigating, and they were only a few hundred miles off course, landing in what we now call Massachusetts. So the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I had claimed Virginia for herself. The Pilgrim Fathers purposed to move thither, but as I say, they ended up at Plymouth Rock. So they were going to settle in land which had never been under the plough. There was so much fertile land, it would be very easy to make a living. So they were taking an enormous gamble. They were going to live with these unknown people, the indigenous people of America. The chance of perishing on the voyage were high, and if you got ill, well, we'll get you to a hospital in a few months. Well, you wouldn't. There were no hospitals in America. So people were either very religiously zealous or desperate to make this voyage. There might be strange diseases in America which they had not encountered. Remember, life was very short and always very chancy. But this was even chancier, going to America at the time. It was almost like going to another planet, and people would cross the ocean. The idea is they would never ever return. It was such a long, dangerous, and expensive voyage, because of course you had to pay for your food in advance for all those months. You couldn't rely on catching many fish. And so whole families went. A baby was indeed born on the voyage. So those who were going to take such an enormous risk tended to be from the lower margin of society. Some of them were desperately poor. Not all the people on the Mayflower were going for religious reasons. Some were economic migrants. So in 1620, they sailed and their 3 ships landed. We only talk about the big one, the Mayflower. The other 2 had been poorly built and had some leakage problems. Finally, they cried land ho. Well, they're at the New World. So anyway, they disembarked, built themselves their town. They planted their crops and tried to hunt. They saw this bird 3 times bigger than a chicken. We call it a turkey. I'll tell you why. Because when they were taken back to Europe sometime afterwards, people were confused as to which country it had come from. And the English thought it had come from Turkey, as in the Turkey, the country. In other European countries, they thought it came from India, which is why it's Hind or Dand or Induk in various other European languages, as in an allusion to India. So anyway, in November, some Native Americans emerged from the woods to meet these English immigrants who started to drop like flies. Some were taken very ill, were suffering malnutrition. And the Native Americans were not the savage brutes of English prejudice, and they shared their food with the starving settlers. So settler, immigrant, the 2 are synonyms, despite what Ann Coulter would pretend. Look it up in a thesaurus. One word will lead you to the other. So although the Pilgrim Fathers suffered some deaths, they made it through the winter. Incidentally, on the voyage over, they'd signed the Mayflower Compact, their agreement about this new polity they would establish. Had it not been for the aid of the Native Americans, it's likely they would have died out. So we know Jamestown, founded in 1607, and Virginia flourished. There was an earlier English settlement, Roanoke, and the people just vanished. We're not quite sure what happened there. So year after year, immigrants in America and their descendants commemorated the fact that people had made it through the winter. The Pilgrims marked the occasion with Thanksgiving, giving thanks to God. So that expression was not new for the English at the time. After 1603, the foiling of the Gunpowder Plot, Parliament in England and Wales had passed the Thanksgiving Act to express gratitude to God for the deliverance of King James I. Anyway, notably, the Pilgrim Fathers did not give thanks to the Native Americans. If white Americans had given thanks to the Native Americans who'd actually saved them, then perhaps Native Americans would have been treated with a little more consideration. So Americans will make strenuous efforts to visit family at Thanksgiving. It's almost like an alternative Christmas about a month earlier. And be grateful to have a home and a family. And some people celebrate in a religious manner. So the holiday wasn't fixed until Roosevelt in the 1930s, so the 4th Thursday in November, because occasionally there are 5. So that's not necessarily the last Thursday. So Thursday's a day off work, but in reality, most people don't make it to work on Friday. That's Black Friday, when this manic shopping for Christmas begins, and see how commercialized that is. Somewhat militates against the pure and unmaterialistic spirit of Thanksgiving itself. So it's a very bad time to travel in America because many people are on the move. Trains, planes, and automobiles. So there's a time when many football games are played. When I say that, I mean American football, because obviously outside the United States, football usually means what Americans call soccer. So at Thanksgiving, people eat turkey and American pie. They're both distinctively American dishes. The saying goes, something is as American as apple pie. People often drink eggnog I've had it years ago that was revolting. The alcoholic and non-alcoholic versions. So in the White House, a turkey is presented in the cage as though to be executed and then reprieved by the president. So Thanksgiving is almost as important as Christmas. And people can't be with their relatives at Yuletide. They'll try to do it at Thanksgiving instead. So I met some Americans who are astonished that Ireland doesn't have Thanksgiving, and most countries around the world don't, because it's not part of a historical experience. Canadians mark Thanksgiving, but they do it in October just to prove they're not American. Countries which are heavily influenced by the United States, for instance, the Philippines, people often mark it there. So that is Thanksgiving in a nutshell. Well, I hope you're celebrating it. And the Pilgrim Fathers, well, those who came after them were often invaders because they were often fighting and driving off those who already lived there. And by the way, was it wrong of the Native Americans to give free food to these starving people? Is that welfare, of which many Republicans would disapprove? So that's that. Yeah, I'm coming on to the political side, modern day. I realize every country is allowed to decide its own immigration policy and should protect its borders, and you shouldn't immigrate illegally, and it's reasonable for a country to remove those who have illegally immigrated. I do think there ought to be some mercy and forgiveness after 20 years or something. That's that. Yeah, and America's not the only country to be founded by invasion. Almost every country is founded by invasion. So not singling America out like that. So that's that. Remember what the first Thanksgiving was really like.